Hello, fellow students and Dr. Deanne Sanchez. My name is Tanya Smith, and I'm presenting on the psychological contract. What is the psychological contract? Argus first applied the term psychological contract that is used to describe the relationship between the employee and the organization, as well as the interaction on any other parties. He defined the contract as an unwritten and subjective understanding between two sides with respect to mutual norms. The psychological contract is a step ahead of trust. It is a contract comprising of a set of reciprocal expectations not necessarily agreed upon by the parties, but in the mind of the observer. As these expectations may not be written and may not be shared, there is a chance that they might not be fulfilled. What are the theories involved in the psychological contract? Several theories have been associated with theory, motivation theory, cognitive dissonance theory, and equity theory. In the social exchange theory, the employment relationship between the employee and the employer can be interpreted in terms of exchanges. The employee and employer will be satisfied in their relationship as long as they can meet each other's requirements. A psychological contract is a concept that shows the nature of the exchange relationship between the employee and the employer. Smithson and Lewis view the psychological contract as the extension of the philosophical concept, which is social contract theory. According to the social contract theory, where there is a social relationship among individuals, there is an exchange of economic as well as social resources. Theory, individuals hold beliefs about their inputs and outputs in their organization, and they compare the ratios of their inputs and outputs to the inputs and outputs of others within the organization. Individuals have a unique sensitivity to fair and unfair situations. People will try to find an equitable balance between their contributions in the organization and what they receive from it. When individuals feel that what they have invested in their company is greater than what they received in return, they become more motivated to react in a way that will restore the equity. Cognitive dissonance theory comes from the negative reciprocity perspective. When an employee perceives a psychological contract breach or an employer's failure to fulfill his or her promised obligations, the employee may perceive these apparent broken promises as wrongdoings on the part of his or her employer. Whenever an employer makes promises to an employee in exchange for the employee's contributions in an employment relationship, the employer's act of breaking the promise limits the possibility that the employee will exhibit the desired work-related outcomes. As a consequence, the perceived broken promises may lead the employee to feel dissatisfied with the employment relationship and experience cognitive dissonance. According to the motivation theory, an ideology-infused contract increases the values of relationship, meaning significant people feel more important by their works. People demonstrate their social citizenship behavior by a contract based on ideology. Organizational justice is another piece of the psychological contract. It refers to the employee's perceptions of fairness received from the organization, and organizational justice and the psychological contract are similar, yet distinct concepts. A psychological contract breach would be perceived as unfair treatment by an employee, although the psychological contract is somewhat broader than the organizational justice and accounts for additional variance in the psychological health outcomes. So what are the components of the psychological contract? What is it that the employee and the employer are expected to give and receive in this contract? While written labor contracts include all kinds of explicit monetary and non-monetary employment conditions such as wages, required hours, and holidays off, the psychological contract focuses on largely unspoken promises between the employer and the employee. Unwritten psychological contracts between employers and employees encompass expectations about tangible and intangible items. Tangible items include the wages, benefits, employee productivity, and attendance. Intangible items include loyalty, fair treatment, job security. The psychological contract is an exchange in the relationship that encompasses an employee's perceptions of reciprocal promises and obligations between themselves and their employer. These obligations can include pay for performance, promotion opportunities, training, and level of responsibility provided. Psychological contracts can arise through overt promises, past exchanges, and observations made by the employee. They are inherently subjective, incorporating the individual's perceptions of the obligations of the other party, rather than representing a common understanding of the obligations between two parties. Consequently, employees and employers may have entirely different perceptions of their obligations and how these obligations could be and have been fulfilled. So, just why is a psychological contract important to an organization or a company? The psychological contract is an important framework for understanding the nature of the employment relationship and the impact that they can have on an organization's outcomes. The concept of the psychological contract has attracted attention mostly for two reasons. It's a way of understanding and managing attitudes and behaviors within a company, and it's a means for identifying how the employee-employer exchange relationship evolves over time. Psychological contracts matter to organizations because managing expectations during the onboarding stage can have a real influence on individuals' performance and their commitment to the organization. On the other hand, when employees perceive that the organization has not kept its obligations, those who stay in the organization may neglect their work duties, and those who have highly marketable skills may leave. There are three main types of psychological contracts. They are relational, transactional, and ideological. Transactional contracts focus on specific short-term and economic obligations entailing limited involvement of the parties. Employees with strong transactional contract orientations focus on economic exchange, where obligations are clearly defined and employees presume immediate compensation for their contributions. Relational contract orientations focus on broad, open-ended, and long-term obligations, based on the exchange of not only economic elements, but also socio-emotional elements such as loyalty and support. Transactional psychological contracts have little commitment from the parties and a clear emphasis on short-term financial requirements in a way that the individuality of the parties is irrelevant. The relational psychological contract has psychological and social aspects. A transactional psychological contract has short-term nature, and a relational psychological contract has a long-term nature. Employees with strong transactional contract orientation tend to engage in behavior that is in line with turnover intentions and deviance behaviors. Transactional contracts signal that employees really just want to keep their relationship with their organizations at arm's length. They don't become enmeshed in the organization. Employees focus primarily on clearly defined expectations and reduce the likelihood that they will engage in discretionary behaviors that result in little or no immediate economic returns. There is a third type of psychological contract that was proposed by Godwin in 1996. This contract is a communal type in which one party provides the benefits to meet the needs of the other party due to concerns about his or her own welfare. In other words, this type of contract occurs by a norm that requires taking care of each other. Unlike a relational contract that is controlled by the reciprocity norm, this occurs as an ideology-infused psychological contract. The ideological psychological contract is defined as credible commitments to pursue a value, cause, or principle, not limited to self-interest, that are implicitly exchanged at the nexus of the individual organizational relationship. Ideological psychological contract seems to be present in organizations with strong interest on values. Ideological contents such as professional and administrative ideologies will shape employee-organization relationships over and above relational, and economic obligations involved in the transactional and relational contracts. Ideological contracts should involve two components: workers' perception that the organization is obligated to provide the conditions for realizing moral ideals, and their own obligations to participate in the organization's mission. When people have high levels of ideological commitment, they work well to regulate their relations with the organization. In 2001, Denise Rousseau presented a model of psychological contract building which is strongly based on the mental model perspective on psychological contracts. The model outlines 5 phases of psychological contract formation. In the first phase, the pre-employment phase, it's influenced by professional norms of societal beliefs. At this phase, the psychological contract formation, professional learning, and media portrayal of certain occupations may have an influence on the type of schema developed. The second phase is the recruitment phase. This is the process of active promise exchange by both the employing organization and the prospective employee. This is a two-way communication of perceptions of promises made by both sides in the employment relationship. Phase 3 occurs during early organizational socialization, where, according to Rousseau, there is continuing promise exchange, and both parties actively continue to seek information about each other from a variety of sources such as coworkers, line managers, and or customers. The next phase is later experiences, where promise exchange is more intermittent. Information seeking by the employee and the employer is less active. And the final phase involves evaluation. Revision and possible breach of psychological contract occur in this phase. In a longitudinal study conducted over 3 years in an autonomous federal government agency in Brazil, Maia and Bastos identified 4 trajectories of organizational commitment in regards to psychological contract fulfillment. The 4 trajectories are high match, learning to love, honeymoon hangover, and learning to hate. High match is where the commitment of the employee was high at the beginning of the employment and remained strong throughout the years. Learning to love is where the commitment was relatively low at the beginning of employment, but gained strength over the years. The honeymoon hangover represents a weakening after entry of the bond that was initially strong. And the learning to hate scenario is where the individual had more of an ideological view of the employer and feels that his or her views of the employer has dramatically decreased. In this study, the Learning to Love group expressed that their managers were in close contact with each employee and were thorough in performance appraisals, giving feedback on their performance. They also liked the flexibility of the firm's working hours and the negotiation of holidays. The High Match group felt dedicated to the improvement in themselves to propel the company. They did not like people who complained, and they felt that they were encouraged in their professional development and that it was a pleasant working environment. Their commitment level remained high and consistent over the 3 years of the study. The honeymoon hangover group started out with high levels of commitment, but felt that their psychological contract needs had been unmet. They described not having any more long-term plans with the company. This group reported that their expectations of the company changed because of changes in their personal lives, and they felt that there were no more opportunities for growth within the company. The Learning to Hate group originally did have high expectations of the firm and had ideas of professional growth and development within the company. When these goals were unmet, they felt stagnant. They learned to hate the organization. They said that they were there for the salary and knew they couldn't be fired because it was a government job. They would do what they were told, but only the bare minimum to get by. They felt betrayed, and their work was just an obligation. This study contributes on the interpretation of how fulfillment of employer obligations in the psychological contract and its breaches and violations are related to the process of becoming more or less committed or even not committed to an organization at all. It is important to be aware of bearing psychological contract issues with foreign employees if HR efforts are to be successful. There have been psychological contract studies done in other countries as well as the U.S. Here are some of the studies. The first one, utilizing employees that were working in the Jordanian insurance companies. Insight was gained on how employee attitude and behavior is influenced by psychological contract breach. This study found that psychological contract breach results show that when employees perceive their employers to have broken many of their promises, it results in a decrease in job satisfaction and commitment, as well as decrease in employee performance and enthusiasm toward the company. The result was also found to be in line with equity theory. This study, it was suggested that when employees perceive that their employers have failed to fulfill their obligations and promises, they normally feel less satisfied and tend to withhold their own contributions. In the second study, an analysis of 300 production employees in India revealed that there were 3 dimensions of psychological contract violation: employee obligation, employer obligation, and psychological contract fulfillment, significantly and negatively correlated with organizational and also with interpersonal counterproductive work behavior. This study found psychological contract fulfillment could diminish counterproductive workplace behavior. When 2 parties are working interdependently, a mutual understanding of the terms of the working agreement leads to satisfactory performance from both parties' perspectives. The third study, a study of social enterprises in Colombia and Italy, performed by Manfredi et al., found that the strong relationships between organizational and employee ideological obligations found in both the Italian and Colombian samples, socially driven organizational cultures, tend to match the perceived ideological obligations of people working in the social enterprise industry. The fact that organizational ideological obligations were positively related to employees' pride of being members of the organization. The employees joined these firms because of ideological reasons and not as much for transactional or relational reasons. They believed in the purpose of the organization and that it fit their ideals. The next study, conducted by Ishak and Shamsher in Pakistan, showed that employees will engage in deviant behaviors when they feel that the psychological contract has been violated. Employees at the Higher Education Commission in Islamabad, Pakistan, reported that there is a significant link between psychological contract breach and workplace deviant behaviors, such as equipment damage, lower work performance, organization of protest against employers. Although it was noticed that it was only idealized workplace deviance because of the economic conditions in Pakistan, in developing countries such as Pakistan, employees are less likely to display deviant behaviors in regards to psychological contract breach due to lack of employment. In a study conducted at a Belgian social profit enterprise, both volunteers and paid workers, positive effects were felt when employees realized that they had enough resources to perform their jobs. Higher demands than resources led to feelings of psychological contract breach. Some job resources, like social support and job demands, were more strongly related to positive and negative effect than others, such as autonomy and workload. Botsford, Morgan, and King's study, performed in the United States, found that new mothers' psychological contract breach was part of an explanation for their departure from the organizations. The psychological contract breach in relation to family helps to explain mothers' intentions to leave the organization above and beyond psychological contract breach related to the traditional work factors such as pay and training opportunities. However, the data also suggests that even when mothers perceive psychological contract breach, their supervisors may have an opportunity to mitigate the damaging effects through fair treatment. In short, when fairness and respect in decision-making processes were shown to the mother by the supervisor, she was less likely to report the intention to leave the company. Psychological contract breach. What is the definition of it? What are the reasons and what are the consequences? A psychological contract breach refers to a person's perception about what extent their employer has failed to adequately fulfill promises or obligations that are owed. Morrison and Robinson in 1997 have given one of the most cited and well accepted definitions of psychological contract breach. They define it as the cognition that one's organization has failed to meet one or more obligations within one's psychological contract in a manner commensurate with one's contributions. Employees who are satisfied with their work activities and those with whom they associate will likely show high commitment to the organization. However, loss of job security or feeling betrayed can lead to job dissatisfaction. A number of studies have found that the breach of the psychological contract is associated with lower job satisfaction. In the past 2 decades, there have been many studies that show that a psychological contract breach plays a crucial role in the field of employment relations and that it exerts a negative influence on employees' attitudes and behaviors. In addition, evidence from academic research shows that breach of employee psychological contracts results in reduced in-role performance. However, breach may not always have consequences for performance. When job security is low, when there are no attractive job alternatives, when there is a high level of loyalty, then breach is less likely to manifest itself in low performance. Psychological contract breach is made through 3 sources. First, specific promises made to employees by the organization. Second, perception of the organization culture and common practices by the employee. And last, in the employee's idealized expectations of how the organization operates. Some examples of employees' neglect at work are their half-hearted efforts to complete a task, higher absenteeism from the workplace, failure to attend office or business meetings, and the failure to maintain the promised office hours. Neglect in response to psychological contract breach can also result in lower job performance. When one party feels that the perceived promises and expectations are not fulfilled, when it leads to a breach of psychological contract. In order to compensate it, the employee may get involved in certain negative behaviors that may be intentionally or unintentionally executed by them. It has been observed that workplace deviant behavior exists in many organizations and its rate is very high, due to which the rate of termination among employees, absenteeism rates, customer complaints, and other organizational results have been increasing. What is management's role in fulfilling the psychological contract? Employers should attempt to understand what employees value in their work setting and how this affects their search for information about what they can expect from their company or organization. By actively paying attention to these personal motives, employers should be able to avoid the development of poor psychological contracts which lack correspondence with organizational reality. Contract beliefs and their fulfillment are strongly related to employees' job performance, employment duration, and extra role contributions. Study after study demonstrates that line managers are the primary contract makers for employees. When employers are unable to meet all of their promises, as is normally the case in the changing business environment of today, managers should be more proactive in managing psychological contracts in a way that can reduce the potential negative effects of contract breach. Managers might make some effort to establish mutual trust and continuous open communication, and focus more effectively on communicating with employees what they can expect in terms of organizational inducement, and provide honest explanations for unfulfilled obligations. Building trust among people in an organization reduces both the perception and negative effects of psychological contract breach. Thus, organizations should develop more explicit policies and with more transparency regarding reward system, benefits, promotions, as well as performance appraisal. A study on nurses and psychological contract fulfillment found that improving and maintaining nurses' attitudinal health outcomes, such as job satisfaction, psychological well-being, commitment to the organization, and their commitment to the nursing profession, may be improved if organizations focus on fulfilling their promises to employees and exercise caution when making promises to employees or making suggestions that employees perceive as a promise, such as during recruitment. Keeping promises made to employees has been found to be much more important than making promises, which cannot be reasonably kept. Therefore, an employment relationship between individual and supervisor is critical, as the supervisor is the likely party or the agent of the organization that is responsible for fulfillment of the psychological contract. There were some limitations in the studies involved in this research. Most of the studies were done by cross-sectional data through self-reported questionnaires. Only one longitudinal study was found in the research, and that could lead to a cultural bias. The studies were based on the perception of the psychological contract and its consequences when breached, only from the employee perspective, and it didn't take into account the employer perspective. The psychological contract is subjective in nature, and considering that it is subjective in nature, there are many limitations in the defining of one person's needs associated with the contract versus that of another. Psychological contracts are subjective in nature. What one person might want fulfilled in their contract, another person wants something totally different. Future studies might uncover what employees want specifically for employers to fulfill in their end of the contract, and how communication can be improved between the employee and the employer to prevent psychological contract breaches. Today, employment is dominated by short-term contracts for highly skilled professionals and technical workers. Staffs are hired on a need-to-have basis to perform specific skill tasks and are let go when their specific skills are no longer required by the organization. Today, the workplace is full of increased workload, stress, and decreased job security and commitment. In such an environment, building and maintaining the psychological contract is very hard, and perceived violation of the psychological contract often results in the employee deliberately reducing their efforts towards work. Employees are important assets for organizations. Much of the success of the organization depends upon the healthy relation between the employer and the employee. Drucker, in 2001, claimed that if the most valuable assets of the 20th century companies were their productive and production equipment, the most valuable assets of the 21st century institutions, whether business or non-business, would be the knowledge of workers and their productivity. Yet so many workplaces are still dominated by old management practices and the inability of managers to inspire their people to volunteer their highest talents and contributions. Why is that still so? People make choices, either consciously or unconsciously, about how much of themselves they will give to their organizations, depending on how they are treated. Thank you all for listening to this presentation of the psychological contract. I hope you found all the information beneficial, and I hope it'll help you in your future HR needs. Thank you. Bye.